Hello all. In this video, we will explain political freedom and economic transparency as the second exercise of data science and big data. The presenters are myself, Yuki Tomotaki, and Brandon Desjardins. I believe many of you are familiar with GDP being used as an indicator of country's current economic strength. GDP is the total value added of all goods and services produced within a country over a certain period. This figure is generally calculated by the country's government statistics department, and the results are reported accordingly. However, there is often debates about how accurately GDP reflects the actual state of the economy. It is said that due to differences in the methods of calculating GDP or political pressure to inflate reports, there are cases where the correct GDP is not accurately reported. If GDP is not reported using a unified global standard, it loses its meaning as it becomes impossible to compare between nations. Therefore, economist Luis Martinez conducted a study comparing GDP data from 184 countries compiled by the World Bank with the actual economic development inferred from nighttime lighting observed by the Defense Meteorological Satellite Program, operated by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Here are the results of this study. This figure is composed of 6 elements. First, the x-axis represents the level of dictatorship in a country, increasing as you move to the right. Second, the y-axis represents the GDP growth rate from 2001 to 2021. Third, the colors. Yellow represent free countries, pink represent partly free countries, and red represent autocratic countries. Fourth, the gray circle represents a reported GDP scale for 2021 by the government. Fifth, the non-gray circle represents a predicted GDP scale for 2021 based on satellite data. Sixth, the vertical line between the circles represents the gap between GDP estimate from satellite images and the GDP reported by the government. Next, Brandon will continue with the explanation.
Yuki and I think there's both redeemable and not so great qualities of this chart. For positives, we think it clearly shows the difference in reported levels of GDP versus actual for different levels of autocracy. We can see that with the large and small vertical lines. Also does a good job of interspersing labels. There isn't one for every country, which would clutter the graph. And you can see those highlighted in the green boxes. The first critique we have is with labeling the GDP. We went over in class that using area to show change is typically underestimated by users. So we think a different shape should be used other than the circle. And also it'd be nice to have a label inside the circle with a number, or at least in the big circles, showing what the actual GDP was. Without the label in the center of the circle, we have no idea what the actual GDP is. The second critique we have is that it's hard to understand what the y-axis versus the size of the circle versus the vertical line is. We clearly understand that the vertical line shows a discrepancy or change, but without the axis labels, it's kind of hard to intuit yourself. And then our final critique is faceting that we went over in class. Since we have 3 different groups here, we'd like to blow them up into individual graphs to maybe see some greater detail and gain some further insight on the data. And that concludes our critique. Thanks for listening.